This podcast is brought to you by the School of Advanced Study, University of London. All of our podcasts are available from our website, www.sas.ac.uk.
So our session was on an extract called Good Enough, you've just said, and it was excellently translated by Emily Jeremiah. So the extract is from a novella, and the extract that we read addresses the experience of becoming pregnant. So the protagonist has not yet had the baby, she's in the state of pregnancy. It's a first-person narration, and we all commented initially on the kind of complex syntax that produces ambiguous and unstable meaning. So from the beginning, the style and the first-person narration was commented on as being problematic in terms of two things. Firstly, at first glance, it gives the impression of an extremely inward-looking, passive, naive, powerlessness, anxious, victim type first-person narrative, divorced from the social. And there was talk of the unreliable narration in relation to complex syntax, like I've said. So there was this sense that the way in which the piece was written did two things at once. It drew the reader in terms of using the personal first person, but it also annoyed us as a group. It seemed that most people found the kind of victim powerlessness, sort of whinging aspect of the first person narration frustrating. But we then, once we looked at the piece and talked about it in more depth, found that there was a counter narrative simultaneously going on within this clever use of the first person. So the manifest sense was of this first person whinging, for want of a better word. And then we realised that underneath that there was much more of a stylised, knowing, analytic and satirical distancing use of language, which produced in us more interest as a group. So that the combination between these two ways of producing a narrative did something to subvert not only the inward-looking first-person narrator, but also she managed then, through the sight of the counter voice, to subvert dominant discourses around subjectivity, around the critique of society, dominant notions of the maternal, and all of the things one would hope someone to do if they were going to be writing about motherhood. So what we then found is that the way in which the counter-narrative, which subverted dominant notions of motherhood, worked was primarily through humour. And the group noted that humour was something which was often lacking in some narratives around motherhood, and that it was a refreshing, welcoming thing to see humour coming in to subvert this manifest, everything's so terrible, doom and gloom first-person narrative that we were first hit with whilst reading this. So humour also allowed her to make some social commentary and also refer to things like the medicalisation of pregnancy, that issues like that. There was a little section where she talks about when at antenatal clinic, when you have to pee into a little bottle for the blood pressure check, and that how it annoyed her so much that it was like a sort of container coming from a coffee machine that wasn't designed to make that experience comfortable, and that it was always messy and chaotic and missing, and just that kind of experience that we might remember. And that is a reference to Irigaray. We thought, well, consciously or unconsciously we didn't know, but in terms of the speculum, talking about the medicalisation of the objects around pregnancy being designed not for the specificity of the female body, but in fact to undermine that physical experience. So we found through humour and through commenting on the minutiae and intimate details of the experience of pregnancy, she managed to associate to feminist philosophy and critiques of the construction of pregnancy in the female body. We then moved on to, all of us noticed, of a heavy preoccupation with death in the text, And there was repetitions of the subject talking about her own death and whether or not she would survive this experience. And so we thought that basically in this text, maternity gets associated with ontological questions of being, of life and death. So away from the realm of sexuality, am I a man, am I a woman, or desire on that Oedipal type level, and down towards a primitive ontology of life, death, am I alive or dead. We then recognised that we thought that there was a repression or a gap or a lacuna in the text which we understood as being relating to abortion, because this woman becomes pregnant accidentally, and she's in the manifest first person narratives very passive, just goes along with everything and it doesn't have much agency. And that we thought maybe that the preoccupation with death was a displacement of her own death, was a displacement onto her desire or question of the notion of abortion. And then someone also commented that abortion wouldn't be appropriate for this subject because abortion is linked to agency and this character didn't have any. But then we also kind of didn't agree with that idea, because we did find agency within the counter narrative that was disrupting the powerlessness, if you see what I mean. I hope that's clear. I don't know if that was, but anyway, so death and ontology and abortion came up as a very strong theme around motherhood and pregnancy, which we thought was interesting. We then went on to the idea of the question. Oh yes, there was a question of intelligence. The text brought up this possibility of an alternative mode of intelligence that allows one to survive as a mother, and we talked about that notion of an alternative to the linear syntax and maternal thought, and that being a suggestion in the text, but then she quickly undermines it too, so that you're never given something in a very clear way. She'll suggest something and then take it away. The discussion then quickly became very focused on and animated around the problems that this text brought up for our group in terms of what somebody called, the fetishization of motherhood that this text seemed to make us feel uncomfortable with. And there was a discussion about the victimization of the maternal subject position, the problematic focus on maternity as a unique specific experience which might collaborate and shore up notions of identity in a post-structuralist climate where identity is something that we want to flee from. And so the kind of wider, broader whole notion of the maternal and motherhood was put under question in our group, because there was a worry around a collaboration with essentialism in a way in which we would never do in any other context, and that the word motherhood was being used in an uncritical way that might shore up a notion of identity which we were uncomfortable with. Am I representing that okay? I mean, yeah. It was then put to the discussion then turned to the question of the network in general, where people were talking about what does it mean to say a literature of motherhood. Is this a women's writing thing we're talking about? What about motherhood as something that's written about by people who are not literally physically women or mothers? And so the discussion from this very specific look at this text, which veered toward both, sort of oscillated between these notions of identity and undermining them, became a larger question of what is at stake and what are the problems with fetishizing and shoring up and making a claim for the maternal as an identity position, when identity politics politically is something that we should distrust. So that was how we ended.